Welcome everyone. We are delighted for our last seminar for 2018 to have a member from our research cluster, Johan, who is also Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy here at our great institution.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, so I'm very happy to be able to speak here at the Language and Communication Research Cluster. So thanks for making that possible. And I would like to spend the time that we have talking about a topic that I've been working on for a while, or let's say I've been thinking about it for a while. So it's a little bit work in progress. I'm working on finalizing my thoughts around it, insofar as that is possible. And that is what I've called the rhetoric of death and dying. And so what concerns me here is the relation between speaking and speech, human language, and death. And there are many ways in which we can think about that relationship. And I want to spend today talking about some of the more foundational aspects of that relationship. We can think about the rhetoric of death and dying as a kind of, which is something that I think needs to be done, and probably has been done by some people, as a kind of exploration of the kind of discourse that we have around death, the kind of discourse that we have around dying in all sorts of spheres of society. And that's obviously a very important and useful thing to do. How do we deal with death? How do we deal with dying? How do we talk about it? How do we fail to talk about it? That has many practical ramifications. I think recently there was a report commissioned by the NHS which identified that doctors often find it very difficult to talk to terminally ill patients about dying, and that this has real repercussions for the kind of care that people sometimes get. That's a practical example of where it is important to think about how we speak about death and dying. But I'm not going to do that sort of thing. Although that is very important, and I hope that I will be able at some point later on to do that, I'm concerned more now with a kind of a philosophical exploration, or maybe a language theoretical exploration of the relation between speech and death. And I want to explain to you a little bit what I mean by that, and then say a little bit about what the kind of insights are that we might get when we think about that relationship. So I will say a little bit about that. I will give an example actually of the kind of thing I have in mind when I talk about rhetoric, which is not from the sphere of death, but from the sphere of male and female discourse, and that will help us to understand what I mean by rhetoric. And then I'll explore a little bit this enigmatic relation between death and language. So I think we can say that, and probably you have all experienced this, that when a person dies in your concrete world, I think it's pretty universal that people feel an urge to say something. That is really the starting point for my consideration here today. If we are confronted with death, we feel an urge to say something. Yeah, you can close the window. It's the noise is also quite distracting. Yeah. Yeah, I think that should be. Thank you. Yeah, please. Yeah. That's better. When a person dies, we feel the urge to speak. We also experience an impossibility to speak, because what we say is always too much, and it's never enough. So it seems that when we are in the sphere of death, or we are confronted with death, with the death of another person, there is a desire to speak, but at the same time there is an impossibility. We feel that we cannot speak. There is a kind of fear even to speak in the face of death, which we experience, I think, in family situations. If a family member dies and there is a service, then the question who is going to speak, or what are you going to say if you are asked to say something. And it's also very difficult to speak because, of course, we're overwhelmed by emotions. It seems to me that from my own experience, it seems to me that there is something peculiar about speaking in this kind of situation. You can say, well, it is a limit situation of human existence. We are confronted with the limits of existence, and that's why we don't know what to say. But there are other experiences where we are confronted with limit experiences, such as the birth of a person, or let's say a deep experience of love, for example, where the relation to language seems to be very different. We don't find it as difficult or to speak in those kinds of situations. So there's something peculiar, I think, around this moment of speaking in the face of death, just as there is something peculiar around the attempt to speak of one's own death, of the moment when all of us are facing this prospect that we are going to die. So that's the first experience. There is a difficulty, or there is something peculiar around speaking in that situation. And so I want to understand a little bit more what that is, what is going on there. Yeah? Initially you might say, well, when we speak in the face of death, or when we are called to speak in the face of somebody has died, then we try to give a meaning. So all our speech is the attempt to give meaning to something. And if we give meaning in the face of death, then we're confronted with the fact that death is meaningless, or it's a confrontation with utter meaninglessness. We cannot give it a meaning, and therefore we don't know what to say. If you look at the history of, let's say, public speaking around death, you find that most of the people who, that's another, like an empirical project that needs to be done at some point. I think you find that a lot of the public discourse around death has to do with matters of remembrance, of mourning, and of sort of highlighting what a person who has died has contributed to you, or to the family, or to the country, or whatever it is. So there is in the speaking is kind of moving away from the fact that they have died. They have died, but we're going to talk about what they were when they were alive. Yeah, you see, so there is in that sort of initial response to how do we give meaning, we very often give meaning by focusing on something around the life of people who have died that has a meaning, or that was the meaning of their lives, but we fail to confront, of course, the fact that they're no longer there, because that is meaningless. That can be maybe expressed in some sense, but it cannot be given a meaning. So that's let's say a first initial way of understanding the relation between death and language, to say when we speak, we try to give meaning to things. And so the problem with speaking to death is that we can't give that a meaning. There is literally nothing to say, right? So now I think that view, which we might find in many different expressions of culture, I think that is insufficient. I think that is not really what is at stake here. There's something much deeper at stake. And I want to sort of try to highlight that a little bit. I want to do that by saying something about so before we go back to death, what I take rhetoric to be. And that is maybe interesting for those of you who are studying language sort of more professionally. I think there is a way to, that's what I try to do in my own work. I've written a bit about it, but not that much, because I also write about other things. But I think there is the need and the possibility for a reflection on language that is not what we would call a scientific or a linguistic study of language. It's also not a study of literature. It's also not a study of how to use language to communicate effectively, but it is a reflection on what it means to be a speaking being. That's the only way I can put it. it seems to me that there is a place in our thinking about language and our thinking about ourselves for a reflection on what it means to be a speaking being. We are speaking beings. We're also a lot of other things. There may be other speaking beings, I don't know, but we are speaking beings, and there seems to me to be something irreducible about the fact that I use words to talk to you. Every attempt to reduce that to a kind of objective occurrence that we can study scientifically, of course, highlights something about language use. It can be studied scientifically, but it fails to miss the point of a conscious reflection of what it means for me to use words to talk to you, or for me to listen to what you are saying. It seems to me that that is a peculiar phenomenon that requires its own articulation and its own way of being thought about and being brought to language itself. I think, this is one of my claims, that what in the Western intellectual tradition was called rhetoric, and still is called rhetoric, I think, is a sort of skewed form of that reflection. It started as a kind of thinking about how to get things done by using language, so it became the study of the art of persuasion, as it were. I think that is just a little fragment of what rhetoric in its broad scope is, which is this reflection on what it means for us to be speakers, to speak. Not in the sense of a scientific study of the object, reducing ourselves to an object that produces sounds, that's one thing, but in the sense of an inward reflection on what it means to speak. And I think that you can find traces of that in the history of rhetoric. So if you read Quintilian or Cicero from antiquity, you find there a very sustained and sort of conscious existential reflection of what it means to portray yourself in speech to others. But at the same time, it remains within this instrumental framework of how do you get things done by speaking. So it's a very peculiar, a very particular orientation on speaking, whereas speaking is actually something much wider. I think in the history of thought, it takes up until Heidegger, really, before we get to a point where somebody becomes aware of this particular focus. And Heidegger is not a thinker that I feel very much sympathy for usually, but I think he has seen something very essential about what it means to think about speaking. And so before we go back to the theme of death, and actually Heidegger says a lot about the relation between death and language, I want to say a few words about this methodical conception. And so I have a little quotation for you, which is number 1 on your handout, which is from a book called On the Way to Language, Unterwegs zur Sprache, in which Heidegger tries to develop in his own language, which we will not dissect today, that would go far too far, but he tries to say a few things about this experience of what it means to be a speaker. And he says the whole point of his book there is to make possible for us an experience with language that we don't normally have. But he says that's quotation number 1, he says, in order to be who we are, we human beings remain committed to and within the being of language, and can never step out of it and look at it from somewhere else. Thus we always see the nature of language only to the extent to which language itself has us in view, has appropriated us to itself. That we cannot know the nature of language, know it according to the traditional concept of knowledge defined in terms of cognition as representation, is not a defect, however, but rather an advantage by which we are favored with a special realm, that realm where we who are needed and used to speak language dwell as mortals. Saying will not let itself be captured in any statement. It demands of us that we achieve by silence the appropriating, initiating movement within the being of language, and do so without talking about silence. So I won't interpret all of that, but I just want to point out to you the fact that he says there is a special realm in which we think of ourselves as the speakers of language, within that lies the realization that we can never know the nature of language if we think about language as an object that we can cognize and of which we can create a representation, as we might do of an object in the world. Why not? Because we are always already within language. So language is always already there, and in Heidegger's words, it has to have spoken to us, as he puts it, before we can actually even say anything. And so we are already within language. So we cannot know it fully as an object. We can make an object out of it for the purpose of insofar as scientific research can study language, can learn a lot about it. But that is not, that already, even science needs language, happens already within language. So it's already there. Yeah? It's always already there. And so later on that becomes a kind of, in other people like Adam, it becomes a notion of hermeneutics, but I don't want to go there. I think what we can take from this is, and Heidegger uses the word saying, is that this moment of saying, I say this, or I say that requires its own articulation. It cannot be reduced to cannot be completely reduced to an object of study. And we'll get a further indication here, and that is precisely this link with death, because Heidegger says this special realm opens up to us because we are mortals, right? And the mortals are those who can die, yeah? Or those maybe who even have to die. He says in quotation 4, mortals are they who can experience death as death. Animals cannot do so, but animals cannot speak either. The essential relation between death and language flashes up before us, but still remains unthought. So Heidegger has seen on the way to language that there is some kind of connection between being able to be a speaker and being a mortal, which means being somebody for whom your own death and the death of others exists. We might say an animal that dies, of course, but although we have to be very careful with the distinction between human and animal, and Heidegger obviously thinks a little bit schematically about that, but nevertheless we can say that there is a difference in the sense, the awareness of the fact that I will die and that others around me like me will die, in humans and in animals. And Heidegger indicates, and he says it flashes up but we don't understand it, indicates that there is a kind of relation between that awareness of death and the fact that we are sayers, speakers, right? So this is what we want to try to understand. So what is that then? Why? So if we were immortal, that's the consequence. We could not speak. Yeah. If we were immortal, we didn't have anything to say. Maybe that's why we hear so little from God. We have to. So I'm trying to get to the point where you feel, what is that relation then? Yeah. It has something to do with. It must have something to do with finitude. It must, for Heidegger at least, it must have something to do with the fact that we are born and we die. Our lives are finite. We don't have a total overview of everything. We do not understand everything. The world in which we live is always a world that is partially occluded for us. If we were to imagine that we have an experience of everything, then we could not give any kind of meaning to that. Yeah? If you imagine just a thought experiment, and that's even still partial, you're sitting in this room, you look around you, you have an image, or you see people sitting, and you hear me speaking, you feel what the temperature is like. And I'm sitting here, you're sitting there, so I know that you have a different view of the same room, and you have a different view of the same room. Imagine now that you would be a consciousness that would experience this room at the same moment from every possible perspective. It blows your mind, and you can imagine that then there would be no meaning. If there is no front side and back side to things, if there's nothing that is not visible because other things are visible, if there's nowhere from where you are looking, then you couldn't even give any meaning to the idea of having a particular view or an experience of a world. Because to experience the world means always, that's the conclusion here, to experience the world always means that you experience that you don't experience all of it. You cannot have a world as an experiencer if that does not also mean that you don't experience everything of that world. So that may already begin to build a bit of a link between the necessity of mortality or awareness of mortality and the possibility of meaning. But that's not enough yet, it remains too abstract, but I just wanted to point it out. So what I think is that there is a possibility for what we then might call a rhetoric as a kind of sustained reflection, a systematic study and reflection, but from an involved perspective on what it means to be a speaker. And there we have to then start with the question, okay, so what does it then mean to be a speaker in the face of mortality, my mortality and the mortality of others? And if we, so I said the history of rhetoric is a kind of shows a kind of skewed understanding of this minute concept of rhetoric, then I think you can see that nowhere more clearly than in the sort of half-conscious, somnambulistic way in which rhetoric has actually been aware of this relation between mortality and language. If you think of the classical form of the public address in rhetorical tradition, it is the funeral oration. It is the eulogy. That's where rhetoric in a way starts, praising the dead. Yeah? So the moment of speech in the face of people who have died. And if we, so are you with me? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if we, if we think of, let's say, one of the most famous classical examples of rhetoric is the funeral oration by Pericles. Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War is one of the highlights of classical literature. It's one of the highlights of, let's say, the discourse of political freedom and the discourse of democracy. It's one of the founding speeches of Athenian democracy, and later on, of course, also revered in later forms of democratic governance. And it is very interesting, and something that I don't think a lot of people have noticed, that it is a funeral oration. It speaks about what it means for citizens of state to be free, but it does that self-consciously in the context of praising those who have died in battle, but not in the British horrible way of Poppy Day, where you get a kind of remembrance culture that exalts warmongering, but actually in a self-conscious way that highlights the relation, in a kind of weird way, the relation between death and language. And I want to read a little bit from the beginning of that. There's also a problem, by the way, with Pericles, and that is that he says that women should be silent, and I think that's at the end of the speech, and I think that has something important to teach us about what I'm trying to say to you, and I will get to that in a minute with a reference to Mary Beard's recent book on women and power, which deals with the question of public speaking. So my quotation here is number 7 that I just want to point out, you read it from. This is the beginning of Pericles. Pericles was the great orator in 5th century Athens, and after the Peloponnesian War he spoke. And he says, so this was an annual commemoration that was ordained by law for a funeral oration to be held on the anniversary of the end of the war. So he begins. Most of those, it's quotation number 7, it's a translation by Richard Hooker. Most of those who have spoken here before me have commended the lawgiver who added this oration to our other funeral customs. It seemed to them a worthy thing that such an honor should be given at their burial to the dead who have fallen on the field of battle. But I should have preferred that when men's deeds have been brave, they should be honored in deed only, and with such an honor as this public funeral which you are now witnessing. then the reputation of many would not have been imperiled on the eloquence or want of eloquence of one, and their virtues believed or not, as he spoke well or ill. For it is difficult to say neither too little nor too much, and even moderation is apt not to give the impression of truthfulness. The friend of the dead who knows the facts is likely to think that the words of the speaker fall short of his knowledge and of his wishes. Another who is not so well informed, when he hears of anything which surpasses his own powers, will be envious and will suspect exaggeration. Mankind are tolerant of the praises of others, so long as each hearer thinks that he can do as well or nearly as well as himself. But when the speaker rises above him, jealousy is aroused and he begins to be incredulous. However, since our ancestors have set the seal of their approval upon the practice, I must obey, and to the utmost of my power shall endeavour to satisfy the wishes and beliefs of all who hear. Let me point out, Pericles starts by saying, it is impossible to speak in the face of death. That's what he says. He says, people who have spoken before me have commended the lawgiver for ordaining this funeral oration, but it would have been better if he hadn't done that. Because how can you speak in the face of death? You either say too much or you say too little, and even if you say enough, it is not good. So his first statement here is, there is a problem about speaking in the face of death, and yet it is the law to do so. So, you see what I'm saying? There is an awareness here, although it is not stated explicitly, but there is an awareness here that death is something that requires language. The law requires us to speak, but at the same time, it is impossible to speak in the face of death. And it would have been better if we hadn't done it. The irony is that that Pericles says this. So the irony is that it has to be said in order for us to see it. And that's where the whole thing turns back on itself. It is only because it is said, it's also only because I'm speaking about this that we may think about it. So it's only because I say that this is an issue or so that it can become known, or that we can actually come to understand it. Yeah? And Pericles indicates that. So it's not irony here. It's not irony in the sense of or self-effacement, but it is actually a recognition of what that relation, in an implicit way, of what that relation is. And what the relation is, Pericles says later on. So, and I'll explain that. Yeah? So we have my indication of what I think rhetoric would be as a reflection of what it means to be a speaking being. We have an indication that there is something essential about that speaking and our awareness of the fact that we die and that others will die. I've indicated that by saying if that wouldn't be the case, there would be no. If we're not finite, we could not give sense to meaning. I've also said there is probably more. Now, before we go back to look at how Pericles, what he actually says, or what the speech indicates to us about this fundamental relation, I want to just highlight 2 points that Mary Beard makes in her recent book, Women and Power, because I think that is a helpful illustration, although it's not so much about death itself. So Mary Beard has written this book, which maybe some of you have already read, Women and Power, a manifesto, in which she does something very interesting. She talks about, the last part of the book is around public speaking. And she talks about, without going into kind of an essentialist view of the difference between male and female language, she says there is, throughout Western culture, there is a silencing of women, which starts already in antiquity, and she gives the example of Homer, where, she gives 2 examples. She gives a lot of examples. She gives an example of Homer where Odysseus returns home, and then Telemachus starts to speak when he comes home, his mother wants to speak, and Telemachus, his son, silences her and says, women should not speak. The mythos, which means that in that context the public speech, belongs to men, and then she goes away. Yeah? And she gives other examples. Of course, in the Bible, we already get women should be silent in the church. She cites the example of Philomela, who was raped and whose tongue was cut out, so she couldn't tell about what happened. But then she weaved the story into a tapestry. And she gives the example of Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, whom we will later on also see in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Fulvia, who was the wife of Mark Antony, and who did something quite astonishing when Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator, had been murdered, or been lynched. It's quote number 5. One particularly bloody anecdote vividly exposes the unresolved gender wars that lay just below the surface of ancient public life. In the course of the Roman civil wars that followed the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, Marcus Tullius Cicero was lynched. The hit squad took him out, triumphantly brought his head and hands to Rome, and pinned him up for all to see on the speaker's platform on the forum. It's again death and speech. It was then, so the story went, that Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, who had been the victim of some of Cicero's most devastating polemics, went along to have a look. And when she saw those bits of him, she removed the pins from her hair and repeatedly stabbed them into the dead man's tongue. It is a disconcerting image of one of the defining articles of female adornment, the hairpin, used as a weapon against the very sight of the production of male speech, a kind of reverse Philomela. And then she says the ancient tradition was paradoxically aware, maybe in the same sense in which Pericles is paradoxically aware, of something problematic with the way that it had ordained and ordered speech. Yeah? One that is determined to reveal its conflicts and paradoxes and to raise bigger questions about the nature and purpose of speech, male or female. We should perhaps take our cue from this and try to bring to the surface the kinds of question we tend to shelve about how we speak in public, why and whose voice fits. Now, what she argues in this book is that it's not so much the fact that women were not allowed to speak, or maybe in some sense are still not allowed to speak, but that there is a particular kind of speech. So she doesn't want to become essentialist about it, but her argument seems to be there is a particular form of speech, call it female speech, which of course that's a very sketchy statement, for which there is no space in public life. That's the problem, and she gives all these examples around being in a meeting as the only woman, and the moment she says something, it's not heard, or a man repeats it, and then it's a good point, but she's not acknowledged for saying it, and these sorts of familiar things. So what she's saying is it is the type of speech for which there is no place. It is not just a matter of fitting in, coming to fit in or be accepted in a particular way in which the culture thinks about what it means to speak, but it is about opening up in order to find that there are other ways of speaking. And that's what she's trying to say there, and that is for her a question of power. Yeah? It is akin to another concept from the rhetorical tradition, about which Foucault has written a lot, parousia, speaking truth to power, which was already identified in antiquity as a particular linguistic practice, and where you see the same thing. That was defined as a situation where it's not so much you claim the same power as others to speak, but you challenge what it means to speak by doing it. Yeah? Now, it seems to me that Beard shows a kind of awareness of rhetoric in the sense in which I mean it, as his fundamental reflection of what it means to speak. And so, I'm not so much interested here in this male-female question, but I am interested in the fact that she seems to be aware of the possibility and the necessity to reflect on what it means to be a speaker in that deeper sense. And it's not for nothing that the examples come out as examples that have to do with this kind of bloody, the limit situation of death, where an orator has been killed and is then stabbed in the tongue. Yeah? So that's just an example to highlight what this kind of rhetoric might actually start to look like. Now, if we go back to Pericles. Later on in the speech, so the speech is all about, and actually Mary Beard could have mentioned that, the speech is all about male virtue. The virtue itself is a kind of masculine category. Towards the end, Pericles says, entirely in line with Mary Beard, she could have given the same example. Pericles says, quotation number 6, right at the end of the speech, he says, he's spoken about manly virtues, and then he says 2 lines about womanly virtues. If I am to speak of womanly virtues to those of you who will henceforth be widows, so he's addressing women whose men have died in battle, let me sum them up in one short admonition. To a woman not to show more weakness than is natural to her sex is a great glory, and not to be talked about for good or for evil among men. So Pericles exhibits totally in line with the kind of classical culture that Mary Beard identifies and says continues up until this point, of completely shutting out the relation between women or the female and speech. And we can ask ourselves, what has that got to do with the theme of the speech? What has that got to do with the idea of male virtue? Is there a connection there with the way Pericles shows to be unaware, really? So he's aware but half aware. Like I said, he's sleepwalking in his expression of the relation between meaning and death. We'll get to that at the end. Let's first try to get to the heart of what this relation then might be, and that is a difficult thing. I find it very difficult. Later on in the speech, when he gets to what is traditionally seen to be the heart of it, in sort of the interpretations of the speech as far as I've been able to research them, he says, and this is in quotation number 8, the sacrifice which they collectively made was individually repaid to them, for they received again, each one for himself, a praise which grows not old, and the noblest of all tombs. I speak not of that in which their remains are laid, but of that in which their glory survives and is proclaimed always and on every fitting occasion, both in word and deed. For the whole earth is the tomb of famous men. Not only are they commemorated by columns and inscriptions in their own country, but in foreign lands there dwells also an unwritten memorial of them, graven not on stone, but in the hearts of men. Make them your examples, and I comes, and esteeming courage to be freedom, and freedom to be happiness. Esteeming courage to be freedom, and freedom to be happiness. Do not weigh too nicely the perils of war. The unfortunate, who has no hope of a change for the better, has less reason to throw away his life than the prosperous, who, if he survive, is always liable to a change for the worse. He's had the best already because he was in battle. Yeah? He's had the best of life. And to whom any accidental fall makes the most serious difference. To a man of spirit, cowardice and disaster coming together are far more bitter than death striking him unperceived at a time when he is full of courage and animated by the general hope. So Pericles paints a kind of life, of a good life, paints an image of a kind of a good, what is an authentic life, of a person who deserves our praise, our fame when they have died, and who is sort of whose tomb is the whole earth, so all the history that comes after them, as it were, yeah, that's what he's trying to say, is somebody for whom courage is freedom and freedom is happiness, and who does not fear death. Right? So it is somebody who does not fear death because he knows that even if he survives the battle, there is so much opportunity, so much chance that life could get worse, that actually he doesn't become indifferent, but he fully accepts mortality. He fully accepts mortality as something that is not just one day I'm going to die, but let it come. Yeah, not in the sense of I want it, please let me die today, but let it come. And I think there's a crucial difference between those two attitudes. It is a kind of soberness. There is a no illusions, but also no hankering after something that you might want forever. So there is an ability to that's the freedom in it, to let go and to have a free relation to yourself and to others. And that is courage, and that is happiness. And I think that is the implication then, of course, that is what allows us to speak. That is the meaning that Heidegger sort of hints at, but it doesn't completely get to, that it is only because we are mortals that we can speak, only because we experience death as death that we can speak. This is what Pericles is he doesn't say it, but you can take it from it, right? To a man of spirit, cowardice and disaster coming together are far more bitter than death striking him unperceived at a time when he is full of courage and animated by the general hope. The courage to be free and to see that that freedom is happiness is the awareness of your mortality. Not awareness in the sense of I am going to die one day, but awareness in the sense of this is coming to me. And because it is coming to me, I can be free. If you overcome your fear of death, life becomes a party. Yeah, that seems to be the implication. And what is more, this is essentially linked to the moment of being a speaker. Without speech, it cannot come about, this relation, and at the same time it is this relation which puts the world free, open before me, so I can say it. Now we can say that the difficulty to speak in the face of death may have to do with sort of that there is a fear to speak in the face of death, which is the fear of death itself. It is our death fear that makes it difficult for us to speak in the face of death, the death of myself or the death of another person. This courage that Pericles talks about, courage of course is something that is not the absence of fear, but the ability to overcome fear. It has an existential meaning, and it has, as it were, a linguistic meaning. So there is a kind of linguistic courage, or I would then say rhetorical courage, that is required to speak in the face of death. Can we then say, and I have to look at the time actually, can we then say that the one who has learned to speak well, classically the rhetor, is the one who has overcome the fear of death, or who has not. So can it be a situation where we no longer experience this urge and this impossibility? And that's kind of a question that now becomes relevant, and it's a kind of an open question. Interestingly enough, so that is maybe an open question. Interestingly enough, quotation number 10 of my talk, that is Mark Antony. Now we hear him himself, at least as Julius Caesar, as Shakespeare portrays him in Julius Caesar, of course, in the famous funeral oration. Bear with me, my heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. He is, in this particular moment, he is or feigns to be overcome by speechlessness, because his heart is with the person who has died. Bear with me, he interrupts his speaking, bear with me, my heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Of course, beautiful language, with that central word coffin there, which sort of really hammers home what we are talking about here. Yeah? I think that word sort of falls down into a deep grave itself there. So beautiful language. So does that then go away or so? Yeah, that might be the question. Can you then become schooled and trained and perfect, eloquent at speaking in the face of death? I think that would be presumptuous, and that would also not be the goal. I think in the funeral oration, it is precisely reflected in the fact that Pericles starts by saying, "Look, I have to speak here, and I'm going to do it, but I really can't." Yeah. That is I think that is a kind of a crucial moment. Yeah. Okay. Heidegger. I just want to. I'm not sure if I can actually formulate that right now. But Heidegger points out, and that those will be my final two quotations here, that Humboldt, the linguist, whom you may know, or whose work you may know, and if you study language you don't know it, then please do study it. That Humboldt, Heidegger always makes a point in all of his works about Humboldt, who was one of the founders of modern general linguistics as we know it, that Humboldt remains caught in this cognitivist representationalist view of knowing. So that for Humboldt, language is an object to study, and Humboldt is one of the first to really write about the diversity of languages, and his early 19th century, for those of you who don't know it, his view of language is that language incorporates what he called the spirit or the soul of people. And so to be a speaker of German or a speaker of English means to live in the German world, to live in the English world. So language is innere Form, is an inner form of thought and of feeling, a structure of feeling that is a whole, as it were, an organic thing, and it differs from language to language. So that's a very romantic idea of language, but of course it's also a view of language that puts language sort of inside, but at the same time sees it as a kind of thing to be studied. And Heidegger says, but we do know, quotation number 2, that the possibility of an innate transformation of language entered Wilhelm von Humboldt's sphere of thought. So he was aware that there was something else. From a passage in his treatise on the diversity of the structure of human language, as his brother tells us, and his brother Alexander von Humboldt was the famous explorer. He was a world traveler. From a passage, as his brother tells us in the foreword, Humboldt worked on his treatise "Lonesome Near a Grave" until his death. His final text that he wrote it "Lonesome and Near a Grave," his brother says. And in that text he writes, the application of an already available phonetic form to the internal purpose of language may be deemed possible in the middle periods of language development, as he calls it. A people could, by inner illumination and favorable external circumstances, impart so different a form to the language handed down to them that it would thereby turn into a wholly new language. He is here thinking about language change in the diachronic sense. People can inherit a language and give it a completely different meaning. Maybe that happens even within languages, between periods in which a language is spoken or different places to which a language travels. But Heidegger hears it as Humboldt being dimly aware, just as Pericles is dimly aware, of the fact that we can change our relation to the language that we speak. It is not the case that we use them different words, but we use them differently. We become aware of the fact that this language is given to us and that we speak it, and that as we do that, we stand in this relation to our finitude. So we come to see that all speaking, in the sense in which I've tried to begin to indicate it to you, is a speaking lonesome near a grave, is a speaking in the face of death. All language becomes a speaking in the face of death. That does not mean that the difficulty goes away, maybe it becomes even more generic in the sense that we can come to experience how difficult it is to say anything at all at any point, and sometimes you can get trapped in that, as I have been myself, this feeling of I just have no idea what to say. But you know, that can happen. But on the other side, what can happen is that we come to experience in a much more authentic way what it means to be a speaker and what that says about our relation to our mortality. And when that has happened, then it's not that that must happen or so, but when it happens, then maybe there is a sense in which we can speak in the face of death, also the death of others that has befallen us in our lives. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. It is a topic that I'm thinking about, as you can tell, and because I'm doing two things at the same time, trying to develop a kind of a new way to think about what it means to study language from within, as it were, and at the same time tackle this quite fundamental problem that is very elusive. That I think there are a lot of loose threads in my discourse, but I hope that you found it useful in some sense. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And we have 5 minutes for questions, so...
Sorry. Yeah.
Any quick questions?
It's quite a long question, is that okay? I'm struck immediately by the tradition that you outline here, which obviously is a robust tradition, the way you describe it. But it's kind of at odds with a tradition that I know reasonably well, and which may, in some ways, contribute to contemporary discourse. And that is, in the United States, in the American tradition, and it's actually named in relation to fiction in 1956 study by Leslie Fiedler, Love and Death in the American Novel.
Yeah.
There's a tradition in which death is conceived slightly differently, not as passivity, but as a kind of activity. You know, something that one would not necessarily aspire to, but one which would like demonstrate that that you had made your mark in the world on the frontier, for example.
Yeah.
And so that gives birth to a tradition in which you can see this in Hemingway, and you can see this in the hard-boiled school of Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
It gives birth to that tradition where men, in particular, don't speak. Right? They don't speak, or if they do speak, they speak in very short sentences with no adverbs or anything of this kind. Because the only certainty of activity in the face of death is dying itself.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, in a way, I think that that's at odds with the robust tradition from classical times that you've discussed. Not necessarily in a progressive way, you know, perhaps in a very conservative way.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's a very helpful remark. I'm not sure. So this idea of leaving your mark by dying, or like I said, maybe not exactly wanting to die, but in the sense of let it come. That is, of course, also very strongly present in Heidegger himself with his glorification of war, as it were, and in Pericles you find it too. There is so he says it's better to be just struck by death in the battlefield than to come home and chat about it. So that is certainly there. And as I was saying, I didn't really work that out, but maybe there is a kind of relation between a sort of a splitting between word and deed that has very much to do with this male discourse, and that has something to do with the fact that Pericles has to silence women at the end. If you look at, I looked a little bit at recent discourses around executions in America, and I found a very interesting article by a female writer who used to be a journalist who went to all these executions in Texas, and was witnessed 300 executions or so, and she was a supporter of capital punishment, That's why she went there and wrote about these executions. But then she had a baby, and then it completely changed her mind. She couldn't do it anymore because she realized that every person, I mean, how stupid do you have to be not to realize that immediately, but that every person who is killed on the gurney also has a mother. Yeah, of course, yeah. So I don't know, I mean, I don't want to essentialize motherhood or anything, but it seems to me that is also something Pericles doesn't talk about. He talks about the women who've been widowed. He doesn't talk about what it means to lose a child. And I think that maybe that is a kind of silencing of a certain type of language or relation to death, and which would hide at an unconscious level a fear of death, or a death drive that is masked as a fear of death. That actually determines this tradition much more than maybe I said. So I think there are maybe these two traditions are much closer related than we think, and they both fall short on realizing the full extent of this relationship. Maybe.
And on that note, I would like to thank you very much.
Okay.
And I hope to see you all at our next seminar, which is going to be on the 11th of January. Same room, Friday, 2:30.